Out on the frontier, danger lurked everywhere, from hostile terrain to wild animals to disease and war. But beyond those real threats, there was another one, this one rooted in fear. From charms against witchcraft to ghost tales whispered by a fire, superstition gave settlers a way to survive the unknown. Today, we're stepping into the world of superstition where faith, fear, and folklore all intertwined. So stick around. Missing this one will most assuredly haunt you later. In the dense forests and canebrakes of colonial America, whispered tales traveled farther and faster than horses, and howling wolves and dark forests served as a backdrop to those whispers. When we think of the American frontier, we often think of pioneers with wagons and rifles and endless courage, but the frontier was not just a physical landscape. It was also a mental and spiritual battlefield of sorts, with human brains trying to make sense of things that they had never seen before. Superstition flourished at the edges of settlement, and for these men and women, folklore wasn't just entertainment. It was a way to explain the unexplainable, to guard against misfortune, and to hold communities together in a world that often seemed hostile and mysterious. These superstitions and folklore came from a blending of old world cultures mixed with new cultures in a new landscape. Europeans brought with them their witches and their saints. African slaves brought with them spiritual powers that seemed to defy their captors. And together, in the dark corners of the colonies and the frontier, these blended into something very distinct and new, an American superstition and an American folklore. Most free settlers came from Europe, bringing with them centuries of superstition. In 1692, the small Puritan town of Salem Village erupted into hysteria. Children convulsed and screamed that witches tormented them. By the time the panic ended, 19 people were hanged and one was pressed to death. Cotton Mather was a complex man born in 1663. He rose to become a Puritan minister, a prolific author, and the president of Harvard and supporter of Yale. He preached with his father, Increase Mather, in the Massachusetts colony. I bet you couldn't have guessed those names. Cotton Mather chronicled and justified the hysteria in Salem in his work, The Wonders of the Invisible World. He warned that Satan's servants walked unseen among the population, and it was proof of a spiritual conflict between good and evil that was continuing to rage even in the New World. And while the Salem witch trials are before our time period, they do set the foundation that the old world belief in witchcraft was still alive and well in the newly settled colonial areas, and Cotton Mather's writings prove that. And while the fervor of witchcraft may have died down somewhat after the Salem witch trials, they never truly went away. In fact, the isolation of the frontier in some instances made it worse as people faced new, unexplainable phenomenon. Practical defenses against witches and other superstitions were everywhere. A Bible verse done in needlework was not only a way to teach a young lady a valuable sewing skill, it was also, when pinned to a wall, a way to ward off evil. Even old clothing became talismans to fend off evil spirits, with old shoes being placed in walls and chimneys of European homes all the way to colonial frontier homes. The idea being that the smell of the old shoes would either ward off witches or, in some cases I've also heard, would attract the witches and they'd get stuck inside the shoe. I'm not sure which one of those was more true or more believed, but I know both are pretty gross. Walls and chimneys of European homes all the way to colonial frontier homes. And as a New World twist, native-style moccasins that were also made by Europeans became a common style footwear, and sometimes those were left in the walls of homes as a substitute for sturdier shoes. African slaves had their own unique relationship with their New World. Unlike other populations of any size, they were distinctly separated from other societies based on their lack of freedom. They brought with them their own cultural norms and beliefs from Africa, and those beliefs found a place in the New World in their new lives. They buried oysters in the corners and thresholds of their homes, as the oyster itself was seen as a spiritual barrier. Archaeology at places like Washington's Ferry Farm, Drayton Hall, and Kingsley Plantation lend evidence to this. The oysters themselves were a product of the natural world, and they represented that. That's based on a West African tradition where the oyster shell represented also the spirit of the deceased. Some evidence also indicates that the oyster shell represents the ocean, and that the ocean itself would carry the spirits of the dead back to Africa. Additionally, there were conjurers, people who were blessed with spiritual powers. Famous Black scholar, author, and activist W.E.B. Du Bois described them in his work, The Souls of Black Folk, as, quote, "the healer of the sick, the interpreter of the unknown, the comforter of the sorrowing, the supernatural avenger of wrong." And these conjurers held a unique skill in that they could see through the veil, which was the name given to the invisible line of distinction between white and black worlds. And it's the last part that intrigues me the most. See, conjurers were a cultural mediator of sorts, able to blend in between the spiritual black world and the social hierarchy of the white European world. Life on the frontier was precarious. Doctors were few and far between, so actual medicine blended with folk medicine and religion and superstition, and they blended into something that perhaps touches on what we now know as the placebo effect, where a belief in a cure actually is as good sometimes as the cure itself. When a child fell sick, a charm or a whispered prayer provided hope. When a storm destroyed crops, it was easier to believe that unseen forces were at work than it was to accept random chaos, because random chaos left little control, while a belief in superstition usually came with it some sort of countermeasure, something that a human could do to ward off the disaster next time. Superstition mattered, and it wasn't just about fear. It was about survival. These beliefs gave shape and control to an unpredictable world. Hunters who suddenly kept missing game or came up empty would unbreech their rifles and vomit them by placing them in streams or violently forcing water through them to flush out the evil. Now, animals carried meaning too. Ergotism, or St. Anthony's fire, is an illness caused by a fungus in grains, like rye grains, and it took a while for symptoms to manifest. Symptoms included convulsions and gangrene, and according to Joseph Doddridge, the illness was circumscribed by the blood of a black cat. Hence, there was scarcely a black cat to be seen whose ears and tail had not been frequently cropped for a contribution of blood. Doddridge wrote a lot about witches and superstition, and he points out one great example that lives on today: almanacs. They were very popular in the 18th century, and you can still buy them in many grocery stores today. Those almanacs often contained a mixture of weather forecasts, astrology, tide tables, and local folklore. In short, superstition was a form of knowledge with a degree of remedy attached, not scientific, but deeply human, and one that touched on the brain's ability to regulate emotions and health based on pure belief. Perhaps J. Hector St. John de Crevecoeur, an 18th century farmer, summed it up best when he stated that, quote, "Securely placed as you are, you can have no idea of our agitations, but by hearsay. No relation can be equal to what we suffer and to what we feel. Every morning my youngest children are sure to have frightful dreams to relate. In vain I exert my authority to keep them silent. It is not in my power. And these images of their disturbed imagination, instead of being frivolously looked upon as in the days of our happiness, are on the contrary considered as warnings and sure prognostics of our future fate. I am not a superstitious man, but since our misfortunes I am grown more timid and less disposed to treat the doctrine of omens with contempt." Superstition also lived on in storytelling and writing, and it led to a greater American folklore. In 1798, Charles Brown published Wyland, or The Transformation, an American Tale, which became known as the first American Gothic novel. And the so what of that novel in the context of this discussion is that the plot, where narrator Clara Wyland describes her brother Theodore's descension into madness, is somewhat representative of the same hysteria that gripped Salem during the witch trials. Now, Theodore believes that he hears voices and is following God's will, so he murders his entire family. The voices are later discovered to be from a town stranger who uses ventriloquism as a dark art. This type of tale wasn't new, but what was new is that this one was set in Pennsylvania with a distinct American setting. And this began to show that American literature had a place on the literary world stage. By the 19th century, nearly all of the iconic American authors such as Washington Irving and Nathaniel Hawthorne had written stories set in the 1700s using both folk beliefs from the 1700s and their own time period of the early 19th century to write such iconic tales as The Devil and Tom Walker and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Later, collectors like Charles M. Skinner were preserving these tales. His Myths and Legends of Our Own Land from 1896 is full of frontier ghost stories, phantom hunters on lonely trails, and spectral armies replaying battles, with witches riding on the night wind. Simply put, as America searched for its own new place on the world stage, we needed a folklore. We needed something unique to offer the world as a way of establishing our so what. Stories like Last of the Mohicans and other epic tales were born out of that. On the American frontier, superstition was more than just a collection of old wives' tales. It was a tool for survival, a way to explain tragedy, and a means of holding a community together in a harsh and unfamiliar world where danger seemed to lurk around every corner. It's such a hard thing for us to comprehend in the 21st century today, and these 18th century legends may seem quaint and trivial, but they reveal something timeless, that human beings use storytelling, ritual, and belief to navigate uncertainty and to regain control in a life that seemed anything but controllable. We've only scratched the surface on this topic, but it's an important one because it allows us to experience 18th century culture through yet another spectrum. Now, please share your favorite superstition or legend in the comments below. Your favorite ghost story may have roots dating all the way back to the 18th century. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you taking your time once again to spend with me as we take a deeper dive into yet another aspect of 18th century frontier culture. And we'll see you next time on the Deerskin Diary.